Sonic the Hedgehog has had more than his fair share of weird games. Between werehogs, the moon being blown up, interspecies romance, and even competing in a set of Olympic games that never even happened, Sonic has been on all sorts of crazy adventures over the past nearly 30 years. Now, weird isn't always bad. I mean, don't get me wrong, the likes of Sonic 06 are both weird and awful, but some of Sonic's odder outings are actually a lot of fun. I'd argue that some of the most criminally overlooked Sonic games are on the Sega Game Gear. Released back in 1990, this behemoth of a handheld console was barely handheld, and it could even suck dry 6 AA batteries in a span of a few hours. But despite its many faults, it also had some dang good Sonic games on it. I mean, there were some not so good Sonic games on it as well, but we'll get to those. On the whole, I think the Game Gear Sonic games are well worth remembering, and clearly Sega thinks so as well, as when they recently released the Game Gear Micro, not one but 2 different models of it feature Sonic games. So with that, I'm Jamie, this is Stuff We Play, and today we're going back to the 90s and going through every single one of Sonic the Hedgehog's weird Sega Game Gear games. In 1991, the first Sonic game was released on the Sega Genesis. This was merely titled Sonic the Hedgehog. Only shortly afterwards, a Game Gear game of the same name was also released. And at first glance, Game Gear Sonic 1 just appears to be a portable take on that original game. That couldn't be farther from the truth. While Game Gear Sonic 1 may feature some stages that share names with their Genesis counterparts, Green Hill, Labyrinth, and Scrap Brain zones come to mind, there's also a plethora of new zones. With this also comes a soundtrack that is truly incredible. This should come as no surprise, as development of this title was spearheaded by Yuzo Koshiro, who's best known for his works on the soundtracks for the Streets of Rage games. Like in the original Genesis Sonic game, Sonic 1 on Game Gear does not feature the iconic spin dash move or even proper special stages where you can nab the mystical Chaos Emeralds. In a normal Sonic romp, these 7 emeralds are spread throughout secret stages that can be accessed through meeting certain criteria, such as finding a giant ring or jumping into a checkpoint with 50 rings or something. However, in 8-bit Sonic 1, the Chaos Emeralds, of which there are only 6, much like in the original Sonic 1, are just spread throughout each stage. The plot here is also basically the same as Sonic 1 on Genesis. The evil Dr. Robotnik is very mean, very fat, and very bent on world domination. As such, it's up to you as Sonic to stop him. And that's basically it. And like any good retro platformer, it doesn't matter that the story is paper thin here, because the platforming is absolutely sublime. A version of this game also appeared on Sega's 8-bit home console, the Master System. It's almost the exact same as the Game Gear version, though there is a larger field of view. There's also a fan-made ROM hack of that version called Sonic 1 FM, which can take advantage of the Master System's optional FM sound chip. While the larger field of view perhaps makes it a bit more fun on the Master System, the Game Gear version is good fun, and well worth checking out. That Master System version can also be a pain to get a hold of over here in Canada. It was the last game ever released for the Master System over here. The Game Gear version, on the other hand, has seen numerous re-releases, with there even being a port available on the Nintendo 3DS eShop. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on Genesis was notable for introducing Sonic's two-tailed fox sidekick, Tails. Sonic 2 on Game Gear brings him back, though instead of having him as a playable character, the game revolves around him being kidnapped at the beginning of the game. There's even both a good and a bad ending here, with it heavily implied that, in the bad ending, Tails is killed by Dr. Robotnik. And who said 8-bit games couldn't be dark? The only way to save Tails and make it past the late game boss fight against the mechanical Silver Sonic is to once again obtain all 6 Chaos Emeralds. Yes, only 6. Even though Sonic 2 on Genesis established that there are actually 7 emeralds and gathering all 7 will allow Sonic to transform to the Dragon Ball ZS Super Sonic, that is never the case in any of the Game Gear games. Really, all these things ever affect is the ending. That's with the exception of Sonic 2 here, where the last levels of the game can only be accessed if you have the emeralds in tow. What makes Sonic 2 on Game Gear truly odd is its high difficulty and its reliance on gimmicks. I was lucky enough to actually get to try this title on a family member's Game Gear as a kid, and goodness, it was brutal. There's blind jumps aplenty, and the first boss features randomized bouncing balls that are rather difficult to dodge. If you make it past that though, you'll have to deal with gimmicks such as 2 puzzles and even an awfully controlling hang glider. Seriously, the hang glider in Sky High Zone is one of the most miserable controlling gimmicks I have ever had to experience in any video game ever. Imagine you're playing a game and then your D-pad controls get rotated 90 degrees. It just doesn't feel good. Add some screen crunch into the mix and Sonic 2 on Game Gear is just a slog of a playthrough. However, that's not to say it's all bad. It has a charming art style and the soundtrack in particular is incredible. And yes, that's even though Yuzo Koshiro was not involved this time. The music here was done by Naomi Hatei and Masafumi Ogata, and while I'm certain I butchered their names, they did a wonderful job here. If you must play this one, just skip the Game Gear version altogether and just play the Power Region exclusive Master System release. There's no screen crunch and some of the boss patterns are actually toned down a bit. Though still a bit more difficult than average Sonic fare, and even with that awful hang glider still present, Sonic 2 on Master System actually has some fun on offer. As for the Game Gear version, stay away from that one at all costs. Sonic Chaos seems like it should be a huge improvement over the past 2 entries. Sonic finally has the iconic spin dash move, Tails is playable, and the graphics are even further improved from the past 2 entries. However, it's very clear that Sega was trying to respond to complaints about 8-bit Sonic 2's weirdly high difficulty. In fact, it seems that their response was just to make Sonic Chaos much more simple and easy. I'd argue perhaps a bit too simple and easy. To start, this game is incredibly short. Even late game levels can be beaten in under a minute. An entire adventure lasts less than half an hour. For comparison, the earlier 2 games usually took around an hour to beat. It doesn't help either that the 6 Chaos Emeralds are incredibly easy to obtain. Though there are finally proper special stages that you have to go through, much like in the Genesis games, you reach them by merely collecting 50 rings. There's no special other requirements to meet or anything, and there's also a plethora of ring boxes spread throughout each stage, making this incredibly easy to accomplish. The whole experience reminds me a lot of New Super Mario Bros. 2. Both are entries in beloved franchises for portable systems, and both revolve around collecting their respective series' collectible currency, these being coins and rings respectively. And somehow, both end up feeling hollow and like they lack identity. Sonic Chaos is certainly much easier to play through than 8-bit Sonic 2. It's also a bit more polished. However, for all its issues, 8-bit Sonic 2 was also just a much more interesting game to play. Alright, I really have to be honest about something. Sonic Triple Trouble is my absolute favorite Game Gear game. It's also a direct sequel to Sonic Chaos. This is especially apparent because in Japan, these games are respectively known as Sonic and Tails and Sonic and Tails 2. But as blah as Sonic Chaos was, Sonic Triple Trouble absolutely shines. This is also the only game so far to have been Game Gear exclusive. No PAL exclusive Master System port here, though there was a fan-made port a few years ago. As a result, Sonic Triple Trouble feels like it was built from the ground up with the Game Gear in mind, and that's because it was. Tails is once again playable here, though his signature flying ability is a bit snappier. Sonic himself now has the ability to curl into a ball while in the air, making the game lend itself better to speedrunning. And the stages are all incredibly memorable. From the trains of Sunset Park to the Donkey Kong Country-esque barrels of Meta Junglera, the zones here leave a lasting impression thanks in part to a combination of rich graphical design, catchy music, and tight stage design. There's also the source of the Triple Trouble name. In this title, the evil Dr. Robotnik has enlisted the help of both Knuckles the Echidna and a new character named Fang the Sniper, or Knack the Weasel depending on your region, but we'll go with Fang here. Fang can only be fought in secret boss fights accessed in each of the special stages, which you once again must traverse to obtain the 6 Chaos Emeralds. He's also a wonderfully expressive character too. For a game with 0 dialogue, Sega's development team managed to make both Fang and Knuckles feel lively, which makes it all the sadder that Fang would never appear in a Sonic platformer again until he had a cameo in 2017's Sonic Mania. While the 3 previous games range from being enjoyable distractions to mediocre romps, Sonic Triple Trouble is the one Game Gear Sonic game that holds a candle to the Genesis titles. It has an identity all its own, and some solid platforming to boot. There is a shocking amount of polish on display here, and if you have a 3DS, definitely grab it from the eShop. And if you still have a Game Gear, well, first off, why, but second off, you should definitely hunt down a cartridge. After the excellent Sonic Triple Trouble, Sega's plans for the Game Gear seemed to change. It was obvious by the mid-90s that despite being more powerful and having a backlit screen, the Game Gear was just not going to be able to sell better than Nintendo's Game Boy. The Game Boy was just cheaper and had this wonderful ability to not suck 6 AA batteries dry in a couple of hours. Oh, and Tetris probably helped too. With one exception, there would be no new 8-bit Sonic platformers after 1994. However, there would be a plethora of different Sonic spin-offs. The most infamous of these are the Sonic Drift games, which were made as Sega's answer to Nintendo's Super Mario Kart on the SNES. Like Nintendo's offering, these games are kart racers involving you racing around flat tracks with a variety of characters. Unlike Nintendo's offering though, these are on an 8-bit handheld with tracks that feel flat and lifeless instead of wacky and charming. Even if some may question why Sonic would dare drive a kart when he's the fastest thing alive, I think it makes sense. He seems like the type of guy who'd want to be a good sport for his friends. Sonic being a good sport or not, that doesn't change the fact that the Sonic Drift titles are just boring racers. The most interesting thing of note here is that the original Sonic Drift was Japanese exclusive. It didn't see a re-release until years later on one of the numerous Sonic compilation discs. Despite that, Sonic Drift 2 was still just called Sonic Drift 2 when it came out in North America, which I'm sure caused confusion at least 2 or 3 90s kids. In 2020 though, if you're craving playing any Sonic racing game from this era, just play the weird and funky Sonic R on the Saturn. Tails Sky Patrol is a rather short Japanese exclusive on-rail shooter featuring Sonic's two-tailed sidekick. In this title, you play as Tails as he goes through these on-rail stages to fight a one-off villain named Wendy Witchcart. You have a ring that you can use both to attack enemies and interact with stage obstacles, and it's overall a rather enjoyable little playthrough. There's really not a lot to say about Tails Sky Patrol, due in part to how short it is. That's not to say it isn't fun or unique though. And if it looks cool to you, maybe check it out. The only releases it's had in North America have been via Sonic Adventure DX and Sonic Gems Collection, so if you want to give this one a shot, maybe just track down a GameCube. Tails was lucky enough to not just have one, but 2 different spin-offs featuring him that were released in 1995. Tails' Adventure was developed by a studio called Aspect, and features the titular flying fox going on a slower paced adventure through an island in which he has to learn abilities and collect items along the way. I'm inclined to call this one a more Metroid-esque Sonic game due in part to its kind of non-linear nature, but I think it's also a good bit slower than average Metroid fare. That's not to say it's bad, I think there's actually a lot of fun to be had here. Perhaps methodical is the word I'm looking for. The game looks and sounds excellent, and Tails himself is fun to play as. The story here also changes a bit depending on the region you're in. In the English version, this title is set after Sonic 3 and involves Sonic and Tails being on vacation. In the Japanese version though, this is a prequel to Sonic 2 and is Tails' first canonical appearance. That explains why he has to learn several of his standard singing abilities throughout it. Both versions, however, take place on a mysterious Coco Island. And for perhaps the first time in the series, Tails' knack for creating inventions and solving puzzles is at the forefront. This is a truly different Sonic game, and it's one that I feel is criminally underlooked. It's not what I'd call a hidden gem per se, as I feel it won't be many Sonic fans' cup of tea, but is definitely unique enough to at least be worth giving a shot. Sonic Labyrinth is a game that gets a bad rep. It's an isometric puzzle platformer where, thanks to Dr. Robotnik sabotaging Sonic's running shoes, Sonic has to move at a shockingly slow pace. And really, it's a game that deserves that bad rap. Sonic Labyrinth is dreadful, awful, it's terrible. The isometric puzzle solving is awkward. The presentation is underwhelming. The only way to get a boost of speed is to use Sonic's spin dash move, and that's so unwieldy that you may as well just ignore it most of the time. It's honestly baffling that anyone at Sega thought this was a good idea. Seeing as Sonic Labyrinth was released in November 1995, perhaps they thought they could just sell a few more Game Gears in time for Christmas, even if the game's quality was abysmal. But for as awful as Sonic Labyrinth is, it's at least memorable for how terrible it is. Besides, clearly Sega's at least somewhat proud of it, as this too would later get a re-release on the Nintendo 3DS eShop. There's a saying I like to use when talking about video games. The only thing worse than a bad game is a boring game. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on Game Gear was painfully frustrating, but I remember those frustrations and I can talk about them now. Sonic Labyrinth was slow and clunky, but it's so legendarily slow and clunky that's become the butt of many jokes within the Sega fanbase. But what about Sonic Blast? Well, Sonic Blast is just a textbook definition of boring. Released in 1996, this was the final Sonic game released on the Game Gear. It features both Sonic and Knuckles as playable characters. Both play exactly as they did in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, albeit a good bit slower. Sonic Blast likes to make it feel like you're wading through a pool of syrup. The game is also presented in a pseudo 3D art style, clearly taking inspiration from the then new Sonic 3D Blast on home consoles. However, unlike that title, Sonic Blast's art style just feels lifeless to me. This title is ridiculously easy, save for a garbage water level. The music is ridiculously blah. Oh, and the zone names here are ridiculously generic. Along with the return of the iconic Green Hill Zone, there's also the likes of Yellow Desert and Red Volcano. For comparison, some previous Game Gear titles featured zones such as Aqua Lake, Robotnik Winter, Scrambled Egg Zone, and most epic sounding of all, Atomic Destroyer Zone. For all of Game Gear's Sonic Blast's flaws though, it at least has nothing on the terrible Master System version. Along with being the final Game Gear Sonic game, Sonic Blast was also the final Master System Sonic game, with that port coming out exclusively in Brazil in 1997. Sonic Blast on Master System is quite obviously just a straight port of the Game Gear version, with the title screen and special stages running in a kind of weird looking Game Gear-esque aspect ratio. There's also many graphical glitches, caused by this appearing to just have been a hastily made port. This is just a depressing end for Sonic's run on Sega's 8-bit line of systems. The Master System port is terrible, and the Game Gear version is sleep-inducingly boring. Despite having gotten not just a 3DS port, but also a dedicated plug-and-play console featuring it, Sonic Blast is a game so unmemorable that, in the scope of gaming history, it's best left as just a footnote. These would not be the last of Sonic's handheld adventures. I mean, seeing how popular Sonic Mania Plus is on Nintendo Switch, I think that's a given. But there were also a few other Game Gear releases. For starters, a couple of Genesis Sonic titles got straight handheld ports. Both the puzzle game Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine and the virtual pinball adventure Sonic Spinball got Game Gear versions. The former is fairly solid, and the latter is a pretty miserable experience. Both, however, don't hold a candle to the Genesis versions. There is also a European exclusive cartridge titled Sonic 2-in-1, which featured both Game Gear Sonic 2 and Game Gear Sonic Spinball. Despite both the games on it being rather lackluster, it's a sought-after cartridge by collectors. This title is so rare, in fact, that getting a copy nowadays could cost you up to 30 whole US dollars. Which I promise is expensive by Game Gear standards. Finally, to end off on a positive note, I'd like to note the final 8-bit style Sonic game ever developed by Sega. This would be Sonic Pocket Adventure, which came out in 1999 for the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Created by the team that would later form Dimps, the studio that would create the Sonic Advance titles in the Game Boy Advance, Pocket Adventure is like a best of the Sega Genesis titles. All of the zone themes, layouts, and music are based off zones from Sonic 2 and 3 on the Genesis, though all of the bosses are fully original, and Sonic and Robotnik's designs are based off those from Sonic Adventure on the Sega Dreamcast. It's absolutely a strange title. There's no denying that, but it's also incredibly fun. And like many of the games we've looked at today, it fits the bill of being both obscure and cool. Good games, bad games, all are worth talking about in some way, shape, or form. While some have more lasting appeal than others, the weird factor alone makes a lot of these absolutely fascinating to me. Sometimes being weird and retro alone is what makes things worth remembering. So with that, I'm Jamie. This is Stuff We Play. Thank you to infinitefrontiers.org.uk for helping make this video possible. Read my companion article to this video over there, and thank you very much for watching. Stay classy, and I'll see you next time.